7 years. That's how long one woman spent chasing relief from chronic pain. Every morning she took the capsules. Every night, she waited for something to change. And every morning, the pain was still there waiting for her. The reviews were convincing. The testimonials were everywhere. Thousands of people swore it worked. Some called it life-changing. Others called it a miracle. So she kept taking it, month after month, year after year. And without realizing it, she was spending the one thing she could never get back. But the real danger wasn't that the remedy failed. The real danger was what she wasn't doing while she trusted it. She wasn't looking for something that might actually help. She wasn't asking harder questions. And she wasn't alone. Because every year, millions of people put their faith in remedies they never stop to investigate. Not because they're careless. Because hope is powerful. And hope can be incredibly expensive. Then researchers began asking a simple question. Not whether people believed these remedies worked. Not whether they had been used for generations. But whether they had ever actually been proven to work in humans. What they found was disturbing. Some of the most trusted natural remedies on Earth had never survived the same standards required for ordinary medicine. And some of the remedies people dismissed too quickly performed far better than expected. In other words, the biggest risk wasn't believing the wrong thing. It was missing the right thing. Tonight, we're putting some of the internet's most trusted remedies on trial. Some will survive, most will not. And one of the biggest names in natural health is about to face a verdict almost nobody sees coming. The problem is, almost nobody sets out to believe something false. Most people are trying to solve a problem. Pain, poor sleep, low energy, anxiety. And that's exactly what makes this so complicated. Because the advice doesn't usually come from scammers. It comes from people who genuinely believe they're helping. A friend sends you a video, someone shares a success story, and suddenly, a remedy you've never heard of starts to feel trustworthy. Different names, different promises, but they all trigger the same thought. What if this is the thing that finally works? Maybe you've had that thought yourself. And for a moment, it feels like you've finally found the answer everyone else missed. And that's what makes this dangerous. Because bad advice is easy to ignore. Advice that sounds reasonable is much harder, especially when thousands of people seem to agree. But here's the question almost nobody asks. What if millions of people can be sincere and still be wrong? What if a remedy can feel effective without actually being proven effective? And what if one of the most trusted remedies on this list fails almost immediately when we examine the evidence? Because that's exactly what we're about to find out. And the surprising part is it's probably not the remedy you're thinking of. The first file we opened belonged to a remedy with millions of believers. When researchers asked the one question that mattered, has this remedy actually been shown to work in humans? The answer was uncomfortable. Fail. Because a remedy can dominate the internet while collapsing the moment evidence enters the room. The second file looked stronger. Several human studies. Some encouraging results. But the deeper we looked, the less certain everything became. Uncertain. Then came the third file. This remedy wasn't famous. Yet the studies were there. The claims were modest. The results were more consistent. Pass. And suddenly a pattern began to emerge. The remedies people talked about most were not necessarily the remedies supported by the strongest evidence. Then we arrived at the file everyone seemed to have an opinion about. The plant some people call nature's morphine. Wild lettuce. And that's when the investigation became far more complicated than anyone expected. The problem appeared almost immediately. Unlike the remedies that came before it, wild lettuce arrived with a story. For more than 2,000 years, people have pointed to this plant as proof that nature sometimes hides remarkable secrets in plain sight. Ancient physicians wrote about it. Herbal traditions preserved it. Then the internet discovered it. Suddenly, videos began calling it nature's morphine. Supporters described relief. Critics called it exaggerated. And if we're being honest, everything about the story sounds convincing. Ancient history, traditional use, millions of views, thousands of testimonials. If any remedy looked destined to survive this investigation, wild lettuce seemed like a strong candidate. But history is not evidence, and popularity is not proof. When researchers examined modern human evidence, the picture became much more complicated. Wild lettuce wasn't a complete collapse, but it wasn't a clear victory either. Pass. Fail. Neither side got the result they wanted. And that's when the investigation took an unexpected turn. Researchers couldn't even agree on how reliable the evidence really was. Then the story became stranger. Buried inside wild lettuce were two compounds that kept appearing again and again: Lactucin and Lactucopicrin. Unlike testimonials, these compounds could actually be tested. In laboratory studies, both showed measurable biological activity. Researchers observed analgesic effects. Researchers observed sedative effects. For a moment, that seemed encouraging. Perhaps the supporters weren't imagining everything after all. For a moment, it looked like wild lettuce might actually survive. But that wasn't the real problem. Biological activity is not the same thing as proven clinical effectiveness. And that distinction was about to make the investigation far more complicated. At this point in the investigation, wild lettuce was still alive. Supporters pointed to centuries of use. Critics pointed to weak modern evidence. Neither side had won, because one question refused to disappear. If so many people genuinely believe wild lettuce works, what exactly are they experiencing? Real pain relief? A measurable biological effect? Or something else entirely? And for a moment, it looked like researchers might finally have their answer. The compounds were real. The biological effects appeared real. But then another possibility entered the investigation. To answer that question, researchers had to confront one of the strangest discoveries in medical history. Imagine two patients, same diagnosis, same pain, same frustration. One receives the treatment. The other receives something with no active ingredient at all. Vague slaughter. Both report improvement. Both believe something worked. Both describe real relief. And suddenly, the question becomes much harder. Because if improvement can happen, even when the treatment itself isn't responsible, how do you know what caused the result? The placebo effect. And suddenly, the wild lettuce story becomes much more complicated. Because thousands of success stories can all be completely honest and still prove absolutely nothing. The people are not lying. The relief may feel real, but the cause may not be what anyone believes. That distinction changes everything, because every testimonial supporting wild lettuce now faces the same uncomfortable question. Was it the plant, or was it the expectations surrounding the plant? And the more researchers explored that question, the less certain the answers became, which meant wild lettuce survived this round. But not because the evidence became stronger, because the uncertainty became larger. And that is when the investigation took another unexpected turn. The biggest challenge was no longer proving whether wild lettuce worked. It was figuring out when it didn't. By now, the investigation was moving faster. One by one, the remaining remedies were forced to stand before the evidence. The next file didn't survive long. Millions of views. An almost untouchable reputation. Fail. Because a remedy can dominate the internet while collapsing the moment evidence enters the room. Then came a remedy many people had already written off. The internet treated it like a joke. The evidence didn't. Pass. And suddenly, confidence became dangerous. Because the remedies people trusted most were no longer automatically winning. Then came a remedy that split the room. Supporters pointed to promising results. Critics pointed to serious flaws. Uncertain. And strangely enough, that verdict was starting to sound familiar. Because wild lettuce was trapped in almost the exact same position. Not proven. Not disproven. The next file created another surprise. No hype. Just data. Pass. A pattern was beginning to emerge. The remedies dominating online conversations were not dominating the investigation. And then came the biggest shock so far. The strongest performer in the entire investigation was not the remedy people talked about most. Because if popularity couldn't identify the winners, what else were people getting wrong? Wild lettuce was still alive. But another problem was quietly approaching. Because a remedy can survive every effectiveness test and still become dangerous. By now, the investigation had created a surprising problem. Some remedies were failing, some were surviving, and a few were performing far better than anyone expected. Because effectiveness is only half the story. The other half is risk. Until now, we had been asking one question. Does it work? Now we had to ask a much harder one. What does it cost? The first warning signs appeared in remedies that seemed promising. Stronger evidence. Better results. Then researchers started looking at adverse events. Liver problems appeared, often enough to raise concern. Another remedy seemed harmless. Yet under the wrong circumstances, it could interfere with medications people were already taking. And suddenly, the investigation became much less comfortable. Natural did not automatically mean safe. And through all of these safety questions, Wild lettuce remained difficult to classify. Then came the most uncomfortable discovery so far. One of the strongest performers in the investigation also carried some of the most significant risks. Not because it failed, because people trusted it too much. Can a remedy still deserve your trust if it helps some people, but harms others? And the answer to that question was about to change the entire leaderboard. But risk wasn't the only thing creating confusion. By now, only a few remedies were still standing. And wild lettuce was still caught in the middle. Not proven, not disproven, just unresolved. Because uncertainty creates a vacuum. When answers are missing, stories rush in to fill the space. Maybe it was hidden. Maybe it was suppressed. For a moment, those explanations seem satisfying. And wild lettuce appears to fit the pattern perfectly. On old remedy, a devoted following, limited modern evidence. But the investigation uncovered a much more uncomfortable possibility. Being ignored is not the same thing as being suppressed. Because for a moment, it looked like the mystery had been solved. Maybe the evidence was missing because someone buried it. Simple, comforting, wrong. The deeper researchers looked, the more complicated the story became. Not because evidence of suppression appeared, because clear evidence in either direction never appeared. If wild lettuce wasn't secretly suppressed, that didn't automatically make it effective. It only removed one explanation. Because the real question was never whether wild lettuce had been hidden. The real question was whether it had earned trust. And after everything we had seen, that answer was finally getting close. One final comparison was about to decide which remedies truly earned a place at the top. After 12 minutes of evidence, arguments, surprises, and reversals, only a handful of remedies remained. The internet had already chosen its favorites, but now the evidence would make its choice. Not based on popularity, not based on testimonials, only evidence, only safety, only consistency. The bronze tier came first. These remedies survived the investigation, but barely. Not failures, not winners, simply survivors. Then came the silver tier. The evidence was stronger. The risks were easier to manage. These were remedies that earned cautious trust. At this point, one question had completely taken over the investigation. Where was wild lettuce? It wasn't in bronze. That surprised the critics. It wasn't in silver either. That surprised almost everyone. And suddenly the tension changed. Maybe wild lettuce had reached the gold tier. Maybe the supporters were right. For the first time in the investigation, the outcome no longer looked obvious. The gold tier arrived. The strongest performers in the entire investigation. One by one, they appeared. And wild lettuce wasn't among them. That was the moment everything changed. Wild lettuce didn't belong in bronze. It didn't belong in silver. It didn't belong in gold. Because wild lettuce wasn't a winner. And it wasn't a failure. Wild lettuce finished somewhere most viewers never expected. In its own category, a remedy with genuine historical significance. A remedy with intriguing signals. A remedy with unresolved evidence. Stronger than many critics assumed. Weaker than many supporters believed. Not a miracle. Not a fraud. Just a reminder that uncertainty is often harder to accept than certainty. And that realization exposed a much deeper problem. Because the rankings revealed that people were rarely choosing remedies based on evidence. They were choosing them based on stories. Remember the woman from the beginning? 7 years later, the most important question wasn't whether the remedy worked. It was what those 7 years cost her. At the beginning of this investigation, the question seemed simple. Which remedies work? Which remedies deserve trust? But after everything we uncovered, a different question emerged. What does a wrong belief actually cost? Because the most expensive remedy isn't always the one you buy. Sometimes it's the one you wait for, the one you believe in. She was living with chronic pain. The testimonials were powerful. The comments were convincing. For the first time in months, she felt hope. So she waited. Another week, another month. Maybe the remedy just needed more time. Maybe the breakthrough was right around the corner. Then another calendar page disappeared. Another appointment got postponed. And the clock kept moving. Quietly, relentlessly. That's the cost people rarely calculate, because time feels free until it's gone. And unlike money, time cannot be earned back. That danger doesn't only exist with failed remedies. It can happen with promising remedies. The moment belief becomes stronger than evidence, risk begins to grow. Slowly, almost invisibly, And that's why wild lettuce became such an important part of this investigation. Not because it was a miracle, not because it was a scam, but because it lived in the most dangerous place possible: uncertainty. Supporters saw hidden potential. Critics saw exaggerated claims. Both sides saw what they expected to see. That's the trap, not choosing the wrong remedy. Choosing certainty where certainty doesn't exist. Because once belief starts making decisions that evidence should be making, the consequences become very real. Measured in months, measured in years, measured in opportunities that never come back. And that may be the most expensive price of all. At the beginning of this investigation, we started with a simple question. What if one of the most trusted natural remedies was never actually proven to work? The answer turned out to be more complicated than anyone expected. Some remedies failed. Some survived. Some earned trust. Others borrowed it. And wild lettuce ended up exactly where uncertainty often lives. Somewhere between belief and proof. But maybe that's not the most important thing we discovered. Because this was never really a story about wild lettuce. It was a story about trust. About how easily confidence can look like evidence. How easily popularity can look like truth. How easily a good story can feel like a proven fact. The internet wanted a hero. The internet wanted a fraud. The evidence gave us neither. Instead, it gave us something far more useful: nuance. Some remedies deserve more credit than critics give them. Some deserve less credit than supporters give them. And some remain unanswered questions waiting for better evidence. That's not weakness. That's honesty. Because the people most likely to be misled are the people who stop asking questions. Maybe the real lesson was never whether a remedy deserved your trust. Maybe it was whether your trust had been earned in the first place. Because in a world full of promises and certainty, your greatest advantage is not belief. It's curiosity. What happens when the next remedy is trusted by millions and questioned by almost no one?